we've been focusing on the parami of generosity. And I wanted to focus in particular on practicing generosity in terms of our thoughts and feelings toward people, the story that we tell ourselves about them, particularly in those instances where the inclination might be to judge or be irritated or push away. And having this be an important dimension of generosity. And I was really moved to talk about this after hearing two stories that people shared. One was a meditation teacher who talked about how right near where she lives, there's all this construction happening. So it was very, very loud. The land itself was being altered and torn up. And she was having a lot of reactions to this. And she shared about how she encouraged herself to go for walks when the workers would be there and to say hello and greet them. And then she said really simply something like, and you know, it's getting easier. And, you know, I don't know exactly what she meant by that, but I could feel like her heart was getting easier. Her story and frustration with these people was softening. Even if the people she was saying hello to had no idea that she was working with this, she was deliberately inviting herself not to harbor ill will. And the second was someone who shared about having a friend who was difficult at times to be around because this friend in their parenting was not always responding in the most emotionally mature or grounded way with their child. And this person was kind of sitting with their own reactivity around that and trying to see if there was something that she might say, but knowing that this friend tends to be not very open to feedback. And as she was kind of working with that, another friend reached out to her to vent about this very thing, but in a way that was very judgmental and sort of alarmist about this friend. And the person shared with me that they made a very conscious decision in that conversation to say, yes, you know, I see it too. It's hard and it's hard to be around. And let's remember that it's really hard to be a parent. And haven't we struggled at times and been overwhelmed or reacted in ways that we later just really didn't feel good about? And this too felt like that same kind of generosity, a deliberate choice to not feed or abide in judgment, to acknowledge maybe the discomfort or irritation that's there, the not liking, but challenging the story that might close us off from someone else's humanity and fullness. Because it's so easy, we can be very stingy sometimes with how we view others. We can put people in boxes, and it's not generous. And I could feel with both of these people, not just that they were doing this as a way to help the people in their lives or, you know, even strangers, but actually that it brought lightness to them and connection and an alleviation of that aversion. And I had an experience with this where I actually really struggled with this recently. And it was toward the end of my holiday break. And I hadn't had any time to be out in nature. And the first few days of January here in Massachusetts were really nice, really warm, and I live right near a state forest. So I decided that the last 2 days of my vacation, I would go for a walk each day in the woods. And the first day I was out there, and about halfway through, I started to hear a sort of familiar like pop and boom, louder than usual. And I know that where I walk is kind of close to a shooting range. But I had never been there when the leaves were all gone and the sound really traveled, was so much louder. And I noticed the irritation, but it was sort of the last half of the walk. And I was like, I'll come back tomorrow. It's never been this loud or this constant. It'll be better. You can probably imagine, right? So I come back the next day, and really from beginning to end, the walk was like having someone firing a gun right by my head, it felt like. And there would be these brief moments of reprieve, that feeling when suddenly something that's really unpleasant stops and your whole nervous system settles, and it's like, oh, maybe it won't continue. And then it would start right back up again and everything would tighten. And at one point, I actually started to cry while I was walking. Partly, some of that was just like that tantrum feeling of like, I want it to stop and I can't make it stop. But there were a number of other layers that were very painful that I tried to observe at the time and have been thinking about since. One was that I could not stop hating and creating a story about whoever it was at that shooting range. And on top of that, I was in that space that I think everyone here can relate to, where I was watching myself do that and seeing how painful it was. And I couldn't stop. Or I would stop for maybe half a second, and then I would hear another pop or boom, and it would pick right back up. And how it felt like this person was the cause of so much distress, and I had to kind of push them out of my heart. And it was really just as the Buddha teaches, right? The dukkha of being aligned with what is not wanted, with the unpleasant, and the dukkha also of aversion and hatred. And there were also layers of compassion, right? I remembered that the Buddha taught that overwhelm in the face of discomfort or suffering, that's our doorway, that's our ticket to compassion. And so even as I was caught in that aversion, I was able to recognize, like, wow, this is really hard for you. You're really in this and caught in this, and you wanted quiet and you didn't get it. And that allowed me also to expand that a little bit, feeling a bit more care and compassion for the countless beings, human and non-human, who do not have access to silent or quiet spaces or to nature. And I found myself just saying aloud to the trees, like, I'm so sorry that your home is so loud, relentlessly loud. And thinking about the deer and the birds and the snakes that I often see there, and sort of sending them that, like, wow, if my nervous system was reacting this way, what must it be like to live there where this is happening constantly? The range is open 24 hours a day. And so then also sensing how that tied for me to a deeper grief about our natural world, right? And so while I couldn't quite in the moment be generous toward whoever it was that was at the range, I'm still learning a great deal about how painful it is to be caught in that hatred and judgment and story. You know, as Lori pointed to, turning toward when we meet our limits, when we feel that stinginess. And it, you know, helped me really listen deeply, turning toward that. That was my limit. That part of it was I really needed quiet. And I hadn't realized how exhausted and burned out I was. And so my need to cast this person out of my heart actually was a sign of that vulnerability and need. I have a lot of clients in their 20s who use this phrase that you might have heard, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I find that really helpful because I can try to force generosity or compassion. And it's a helpful question for me. Am I trying to pour from an empty cup? And if so, what's needed here so I can pour into this a little bit? And then things will shift, my heart will trust, and it will open again. And then also thinking about how for some people, and perhaps some of you, if your experiences in your life were that people were not generous toward you in their way they saw you or treated you, or if when you showed openness and generosity that was shamed or punished or was unsafe, then this can be really hard, right? We want to be very gentle with this kind of practice and an invitation to ourselves. Little steps actually are quite massive for our system. And I was thinking about how one of my dearest friends is from a different spiritual tradition than mine, not Buddhism. And she calls this dimension of generosity for her is grace. And she has said that for her, her entire spiritual life, her whole life really is centered around giving herself and others grace, not closing to their common humanity. And so we can practice this, right? And as with all of our practices, it's not forcing. That when we're able to be generous in the way we're perceiving someone or the story we're telling about someone, we can tune into what's that like? How does that feel right here, right now? And when we can't, no problem. We can turn toward that. What's that like? How does that feel? And this is how it feels like in this practice so often, one piece leads to all of it, right? We practice generosity, then we wind up working with stinginess or aversion or judgment or acceptance, non-acceptance. And so I wanted to end with a poem that for me is such a beautiful example of this. This is by Ryokan, who was a Japanese monk who came home to his hut one day to find that all of his very, very meager, poor belongings had been stolen. And this is what he wrote. The thief left it behind, the moon at my window. The thief left it behind, the moon at my window.